about 2 minutes early, but we may need that later on, so we'll just get started. And at this time, we have special music. Very good, thank you. This morning we are going to be in Numbers. We seem to be getting there very quickly here this morning. Numbers chapter 10, sort of picking up where we left off in Exodus. In fact, as far as we have recorded, it is exactly where we left off in Exodus. But as you'll see, there may have been some time frame involved. We'll get that here in a moment. But we're going to pick up in November. Let's try Numbers chapter 10. It's going to be an interesting morning. Numbers chapter 10. And we'll begin in verse 11, go to the end of the chapter to the most extent. But we're going to continue on. How do I respond to chaos? How do I respond when things fall apart around me? How do I respond when my world gets turned upside down? How do we respond even in the continued COVID scenario that we are facing? What are some things that we need to know? We've gone over 17 of them so far in the journey with the children of Israel. Here this morning we look at number 18. And it's a reminder to know our responsibility. We always have a responsibility. There's always something for us to do. And I can tell you this, when catastrophe happens around us, it is easy to go into pause, to go into neutral, to go into kind of a cower back and reassess. And sometimes our reassessing goes on many times indefinitely, unfortunately. But to be able to understand what it is that I need to do, what is it that God has for me, and I know this is kind of following along the last point of knowing our limits, and so I think it's a great next step. We could almost say a part 3, but instead of continuing on, know the limits, I'm going to say know our responsibility and be able to do it. I think, again, in Christianity today, a lot of times the pause button comes too quickly. Instead of realizing that God has called us to move forward. God has called us to continuing on, regardless of what happens. And so, know the responsibility before we do, and I know we just prayed, right, before we special music, but let's pray again. Lord, we do thank you again for your word. I pray that you'd allow me to decrease, that you alone would increase here this morning. I pray that you just direct my words, that we be able to grasp the truths of these verses, that we be able to grasp the points for our life today. From an event, a historical narrative that happened many years ago, that we be able to see the same road before us and be able to respond correctly, appropriately, and to your honor. I just pray that you challenge us in our time in your word now, that you be honored. In Jesus' name, amen. The story is said, and I don't remember if I've said this before as an illustration, but Queen Victoria who later reigned for almost 68 years, or 64 years, I'm sorry, 64 years. When she was a child, she kind of struggled. This will give hope to my wife with Josiah. When she was a child, she sort of was greatly distracted in her schooling. Sounds vaguely familiar in cases. And she obviously, for who she was, she had tutors that did her teaching. I guess you could say homeschooled. And the tutors had like all they could do. They couldn't deal with it anymore. So one of the teachers finally pulled little Victoria away and told her that one day you are going to be queen, more than likely. And if that is the case, you will have a great need for your education right now. And it is said that she was completely oblivious to the fact that what could be ahead for her. But once she understood her future, she understood her present. She understood what I have to do now. And her schooling did a 180-degree turn and a great improvement simply by being told, one day you may, so you need to do this now. But a very different scenario, a very different, much sadder scenario on March 13th, 1964 here in the States. A 28-year-old local bar manager, of all things, is attacked at 3 a.m. while she's on her way back to her apartment in Queens. The victim had a lot of things going wrong with her, which I obviously don't support. Obviously, her employment, for one, being a bar manager, but secondly, her sexual preference was also not correct, which certainly in 1964 would have been a lot more controversial than it is today. However, neither of those things were worthy of the brutal attack that she faced, nor was the attack based on either of those choices anyway. But a man named Mosley, that was his last name, would later admit that he had driven around Queens that night trying to find a victim. And finding her walking home late that night, walking just from her car to her apartment, but walking there along the road, he decided that she was the victim. And he went up to her, grabbed her, and stabbed her. She screamed out, and it is said that one of the neighbors heard her scream, opened up the window, and yelled out to the guy, "Hey, cut that out, leave her alone." And to which the guy ran away. Several minutes later, though, 10:50, I don't remember what the exact number was, but several minutes later, the attacker returned and found, I haven't said her name yet, Catherine. She went by Kitty, with bar manager back in the 60s. I guess everybody was probably named Kitty. Catherine Genovese, Catherine, we'll call her Catherine. He found Catherine still staggering to her apartment door and attacked her again, stabbing her a total of 14 times, raping her, stealing everything she had, and left her for dead. At 3:40 a.m., a 70-year-old neighbor found her near lifeless body on the steps of the apartment, ran downstairs to cradle her body, and yelled for someone to help. Someone called 911. Well, not 911. Someone called police. And at 3:40-ish, police arrived, rushed her to the hospital, but she died before she got help. What was printed in the newspaper, which is the whole reason for this, and I actually was able to find this online. It's crazy what you can find online. A copy of the New York Times. This is the March 27th, so this was 2 weeks after her attack and death. March 27th, 1964, the New York Times. In the very bottom corner of the first page, it says 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. And the alleged, after the 2-week investigation of her death, it was allegedly discovered that 37 people were aware of her attack and her attacker and her helplessness, but refused to step in and get involved. It is said later that in the decades, and I think even 2010, they have issued a correction from something from 1964, if that makes any sense. But in 2010, the New York Times issued a correction to this article and stated that it may have been a little over-exaggerated number, that may have been much fewer people that actually saw it. But one person has admitted that he saw it happen, called a friend, and asked the friend, "What is it that I should do?" And the friend said, "It's best just not to get involved." And literally he watched from his window at 3:30 in the morning as the lady is screaming for help just outside his window and watched her die without help. Now, sadly, as a benefit, you hate to say that there's a benefit of somebody's death, but as a benefit, several things have transpired because of that. One of them, psychologists jumped in and have defined what they determine or label as, quote, the bystander effect. I found this fascinating. If there is only one bystander, if only one person observes somebody in need, there is a 85% chance that they will offer help. So if you're just one person and you see one person in need, there's an 85% chance that you will help them. If there are two bystanders, that percentage goes down to 62%. Two people see somebody in need, they're both going to assume the other will do it, and it's almost less than 2/3 likely that that person will get help. If there are 5 bystanders present, there's a 31% chance that someone will help. And the numbers keep going down. Technically, if it truly was 37 people, according to this psychologist bystander effect, the likelihood of getting her help that she needed pretty much played out exactly as it did. But some other real advantage that happened because of this, the 911 system was started because of this. This was one of the reasons that 911 started. I did not realize this because obviously Stark County did not get 911 until not that long ago. But 911 started in our nation in New York City in 1968, not long after her death. And then Good Samaritan laws are also said to have stemmed from this attack and the nationwide publicity of it here in our nation, which ultimately says that if you are a Good Samaritan and you offer aid, you cannot be sued for doing, Matt can probably help me out here, but you can't be sued for offering that aid even if you do something wrong. Now, if you are trained, if you are expected to know it, and if you're being paid to offer aid, then obviously you can be sued. What I find interesting in our nation, we have Good Samaritan laws, and I know this is kind of along my lines of police and fire and in the past ambulance. But we have Good Samaritan laws in our nation, which protects those that are offering their aid as Good Samaritans. But what we don't have in this nation is duty to rescue laws. Many nations have duty to rescue laws, including Canada to our north, has duty to rescue laws. In other words, if you are witness to somebody needing help and you refuse to offer help, you can actually be sued in civil court for not providing help, even to whatever limited extent you have. And so we have Good Samaritan that helps those that actually do help. Many nations have duty to rescue, which basically requires it. If you see somebody in need, you have to do something to help them. We don't have that in our nation. Can you imagine on a spiritual realm if the Church of God understood the duty to rescue? Imagine as the voice of the gospel, we'll say it that way. We are the voice to share the gospel. If we understood our duty to rescue in the area of the gospel message, if we understood our duty in impacting lives and understand our responsibility in times when our worlds are upside down, if we understood the responsibility that we have to follow what God has called, as I step back, the church is not called to be some sort of social organization. We're not called just to feed the hungry. That's not necessarily what our mission is as a church. It is part of what we do, but it's not necessarily our mission. Our mission is to meet the greatest need, the greater need of salvation, of eternity. But what if we understood a duty to rescue? Let me get even more specific. And I know I'm taking a long time on an introduction here, but there's a reason, because I think the points will kind of fall into place better then. You know how easy it is when there are needs to simply say or do, I'll pray for you. Prayer is one of the elements of the spiritual battle that our God gives us. So we ought to know how to pray. We ought to know how to use it. We ought to know how to use it effectively. As a child of God, it is one of the elements of our spiritual armor that God has blessed us with for our use, for our good, for the good of others. And so we've got to know how to pray. And so certainly not diminishing prayer. But there's a lot of other pieces of the armor involved than just the one piece of prayer. There's a lot more that God has called us to other than just pray. Not diminishing prayer, but reminding us that it's not just about prayer. That He has given us the means, He's given us abilities, He's given us even spiritual gifts for us to move forward and do more than just pray. For the case of this lady, God's called us to do more than just sit in the window and watch and pray on the spiritual realm. The point of the message, if I can say it first, prayer is something that is of great importance, but when we know somebody that's going through a need, our personal responsibility goes beyond that. I've said before, you can't do any of the one another's effectively on social media. You can't do that. Social media is great. It is like a gigantic prayer chain on steroids. You can get word out quickly and massively as friends of friends of friends of friends get involved. Exponentially, things can get out so much faster than what a prayer chain once was able to accomplish. And so in that regard, social media is great. But our God has called us to do more than just pray or to comment praying or whatever it might be. God has called us to do more than that. We can't do any of the one another's on social media. It requires interaction. It requires, if nothing else, at minimum, we should be contacting them even by text to say, hey, how can I help? How can I encourage you? How can I edify you? How can I admonish you? How can I encourage you to continue seeing your God through this? And I fear that, among other things, we live in a day where we, as the body of Christ, has become more content with a response of praying while we sit inside our house and watch. While there are people who have great needs that need, if nothing else, just even a comment, a phone call, a visit, a card, a text message that says, hey, I'm praying for you. What can I do for you? And may we be encouraged to do that. Don't just do the minimum. Don't neglect the minimum, but don't just do the minimum. Now, honestly, there's some danger here. We don't want to neglect prayer, but as well, we don't want to just say, Godspeed, be filled, be warmed, go on your way. James chapter 2 addresses that. And if one of you say unto him, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give them not the things which are an evil to the body. What doth it profit? Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. Now, let me explain James chapter 2 here very quickly. James is not saying that if I don't meet the needs of others, that my faith is dead. That's not what he's doing. What he's comparing, though, is how can I say this? The inconceivable reality of how could you, if someone came to your door and say, hey, I am hungry, how many of you would say, oh, that's nice, that's good of you. Go on your way. I'll be praying for you. James is almost using that statement as nobody would do that. Just like your faith. If there isn't no evidence of your faith, if it goes no deeper than I have faith, verbal, then it is dead. It's not there. To the similar extent, who would say, be filled, be warm, Godspeed, go on your way, not my problem, I'll pray for you. Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, we find a time frame, and the children of Israel are now going to be leaving Sinai, Mount Sinai, and they're beginning their journey to the land that has been promised to them. And in this remainder of Numbers chapter 10, I think we see some amazing responsibility that is accomplished, even beyond what we saw the last 2 weeks in our study. But I want to point out very quickly, kind of as an introduction, if I haven't already done a very lengthy introduction. As far as the timing goes, verse 11 says, it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month, in the second year, that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony, from off the place where they have been encamped, there at the base of the Mount Sinai. And so this kind of a quick review of some timing. I didn't put the references there because I ran out of room at the bottom. But we have from the very beginning of the book of Exodus that on the 14th day, that actually should be 15, but on the 14th day is when God told them to prepare that lamb, to put the blood on the doorposts. For tonight you will be leaving. It is technically the 15th day is when they actually left, but the Passover technically was observed on that 14th day. They left there after midnight, after the cries of the city was up in an uproar, wailing over the loss of the firstborn throughout the entire city. Pharaoh finally says, go, get out of here. Take your people and get out of here. So early morning on the first month, first year, 15th day, we have the exodus from Egypt. In the third month, and it is assumed it's the first day because no day is given, but they assume then, say 2 months later, they enter the wilderness of Sinai. Now we know that there was some backtracking. Remember they started going, is that how I did that? This way, right? You remember the Red Sea's got the two, little Red Sea's got the peace sign. And it's assumed that here they're coming from Egypt, that they're crossing. They originally came to the sea and went north. God had them turn around, and he says, go back. And where God told them to encamp is right where the Egyptians came and met them. And what a reminder how often our God does that. He says, go back. Not because he's keeping us from danger, but he's reminding us of who he is. So he sends them back. And so obviously, to take 2 months to get to the wilderness of Sinai isn't a direct route necessarily. And they've had some times where they encamped and enjoyed the blessings of the water and remember the place of the palm trees and all that they've enjoyed to this point and have not enjoyed to this point as well. But 2 months after leaving, they enter the wilderness of Sinai. The very end of the book of Exodus, we didn't look at this verse, but I believe one of the last verses actually of Exodus says in the first month of the first day of the second year. So we're on the 1 year anniversary, almost the 1 year anniversary of their departure. The tabernacle is complete. Remember last week? They kept bringing, every morning they're bringing more stuff. Finally Moses says, stop it. We have too much. We just need to get the work done. We need to get the job done. Well, at the end of Exodus, the job is done. First day, first month, second year, job is done. Nearly, we'll say 2 weeks short of the 1 year anniversary of their departure. Here we have in verse 11, and it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony. If you do some quick math here, you kind of understand the timing that we have involved here. Number one, it is after the 1 year anniversary of leaving Exodus, or leaving Egypt in the Exodus. But it is also just short, possibly even to the point of 10 days short of the 1 year anniversary of arriving in the wilderness of Sinai. But also, what did they figure out? If I do the math correctly, I think they figured it was about 9 months that they were there at the base of the Mount Sinai. 9 months they were there. We know Moses went up for 2 trips, 40 days each. So we have approximately 3 months involved with those two events. And so we have 6 months for them to finish up the tabernacle, and now they're leaving. What can we learn from the children of Israel in knowing our responsibility? Number one, we need to know God's leading. Let me read these verses. Verses 11 to 13. It came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year that the cloud was taken up from off the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel took their journey out of the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran. And they first took their journey according to the commandment of the Lord by the hand of Moses. If I can make a point of these first 3 verses, it is exactly what verse 13 says. According to the commandment of the Lord. According to the commandment of the Lord. Do we know the commandment of the Lord? Do we know God's leading? To understand my responsibility, I have to know how God is leading me. I have to know what He has for me. Now, human nature, I think, is one that observes the anniversaries of significant events, birthdays, anniversaries. Here next week, 59th anniversary as a church. It's human nature to kind of record events as they occur. I will honestly tell you this. If this were me, in their shoes, just on the focus of timing alone, just in that regard, I'd be saying, no, we shouldn't be leaving now. We should leave in 2 weeks. It'll be the 1 year anniversary of arriving here in this area. or we should have left a few weeks ago. It would be the 1 year anniversary of actually leaving Egypt. And let's do this thing in my fashion, in my order. When we had the church fire in October, in fact, it'd be almost 18 years next week that the church caught on fire. And as they were putting it back together, and it was probably about mid-February, I made a comment to one of the contractors that, hey, you know what, the first time that this building was dedicated was on the last weekend of March in 1970. Do you think there's any chance that we could get this building back together by the last weekend of March of this year? It's 2003. And, well, I don't know if we can do that. We're going to try, but there's a lot of work. In fact, at that time, this was still a gutted building. There were lights dangling from extension cords so they could work in here. I don't know if we can do that, Pastor, but we'll try. And what a joy it was as we got closer. I know I've said this before, that we were able to have our first service back in this building after the fire on the very last weekend of March, right before Caitlin was born, to rededicate the building. In fact, we found some bulletins. In fact, some of them actually were browned, kind of singed from the fire. But we found some bulletins from that first Sunday in this building in 1970, and we literally sang the same songs. Different hymnals, but we found the same songs. We sang them in the same order. Obviously, it was a different pastor because it was me instead of who was here then. But what I think he had the title of the message, and I didn't know where he went with that, but I believe I even copied. This is the title of my message as we rededicate. Literally, I could have just reprinted his bulletin, changed the date on top, and that was our service. Because I found it of great significance that it was on that anniversary weekend. And I'm thankful for our crew that was able to get that done. Now, they continue to work like that next month. They finished up some trim and whatnot that still needed to get done. But what a joy, because you recognize those things. You kind of honor those things in our lives. We have birthdays, and whether we like to or not, we honor them. Some more than others, I guess. But you follow that time frame. In my own home, another aspect of kind of putting humanity into the narrative that we have from these 3 verses. My own household, in our household, we have many times where we are very scheduled, but not, if that makes sense. In other words, there might be things that we want to do on a Friday night, but the timing goes something like this. Whenever Dad is done with the study for Sunday, we will leave. And so that could be early, that could be late, but there's no time frame. We don't say we're leaving at most cases. We're not saying, well, we're going to leave at 5:30, because once I get into the zone, I'm staying right here in this zone until I'm done with this, and then we can go. Many things that we get are from Peoria instead of Menards or Walmart in Kiwani. And so we'll make an occasional list of things that we have to get done in Peoria, and usually Saturday mornings, because I personally love Chick-fil-A breakfast. We will leave Saturday morning and we'll go. My daughters, before they go, and I know this is rude to them and you'll probably take their side, but when we go to bed on Friday night, they'll say, hey, Dad, what time are we leaving? What's my answer? When we're ready. When we're ready. But yeah, we have to know. That's when we're ready. And I've gotten up early every day this week. I'm not setting no alarm. So if I sleep in, we sleep in. If I don't, we don't. If I get up at 6:30 and it's time to go, we're going to go. If I sleep in, then we're going to... When we're ready is when we're going to leave. And my wife, when we awake and we decide, I guess we go, she'll, like her first thing is she'll go and knock on the door. Dad's getting up, so it'll probably be, about a half hour we hitting the road. So they at least get that amount of warning. But otherwise, there's no time frame in certain things. It's just, here's what we're going to do, and it just depends. And I know that there's a great leverage that I have as dad. and ultimately, everybody's got to jump according to my schedule, I guess is how that works. And sometimes I feel bad about that. Most of the time I don't, I guess, I'll be honest. Here's the reality of what is taking place in these verses. And the reason why I gave you this chart, to an extent, is this. These people have undoubtedly grown comfortable. On seemingly nearly 9 months, they have been encamped at the base of this mountain. For nearly 3 months of that, Moses has been gone in 2 different episodes going up to the mountain to speak to God. And then they have worked diligently on this tabernacle. As it is recorded for us, Moses doesn't say, on this day, on this time, we will be leaving. What does that have recorded for us? On this day, literally, is what it says in verse 11. It came to pass on the 20th day of the second month, in the second year. No significance of the date there at all, seemingly, at least in my opinion and my understanding. No significance of that date. Basically, nearly a year and a few weeks beyond the time frame of the year anniversary of their leaving. Suddenly, the cloud that has been resting above them for 9 months begins to move. Which means they have to move. We don't have any notice that says, hey, we're leaving at 8:30 tomorrow morning, start to pack up. They're not given a notice that says, hey, we're done with the tabernacle, probably tomorrow God's going to move us on. There's no indication whatsoever. I remember my grandfather, it'd be funnier if my parents were here, but I'm certain if they're watching at home, they're probably chuckling already. My poor grandma, and sometimes I fear maybe I'm becoming more like my grandpa than my wife is laughing. But my poor grandma, in their house there in their retirement home in Arkansas, they owned a home there, kind of a ranch of sorts there in Arkansas. My grandpa had his chair, and my grandma had her chair, and occasionally my grandpa would just get up. He wouldn't say a word. This would happen when we were there visiting. My grandpa would just get up and he'd go off into the bedroom, and then we never knew if that meant he was using the restroom, maybe he was going to take a nap, or he was getting his shoes. We never knew. Grandpa would just get up without saying a word, and he'd disappear down the hall. And many times he'd come back with his shoes on. In fact, when we would be visiting them specifically, even me as a child, you'd always watch what Grandpa was wearing when he came back down the hallway. If he was wearing the exact same thing that he left, you knew how he used the restroom. If he was wearing anything different, you knew that we were about to leave. And we literally would have enough warning from the time that Grandpa got from where we first spotted him in the hallway until he got to the car. I mean, literally, he would just walk right on past and right out the door into the car. And my poor grandma would just get into the state where as soon as Grandpa stood up, she was getting ready. And she was working on figuring out where her jacket was, her coat was, her shoes were. Because Grandpa, when he came back from the back room, he'd just leave. And if you wanted to go with him, you had to be with him. And he'd usually say something pretty gruff, well, aren't you guys hungry? Oh, we're going out, okay. and you got to quickly respond. Well, I'm not saying that Grandpa was like God or like God was like Grandpa, but what I am saying in these 3 verses is suddenly the cloud is moving. 9 months, 3 months of them literally just working on the tabernacle portion of it, but for 9 months they seemingly have been encamped there. The cloud is been stationary, and suddenly one day, on this day, the cloud begins to move. And we don't have the narrative, but I would love to know who points out, whoa, I think it just moved. and suddenly the whole group is mass moving. Do we know God's leading in our life? Are we ready to respond even if there's little warning? Do we know how to respond even when there's little warning? Am I aware that my God is willing to lead us and going to lead us even when we don't expect it? And I've got to be ready and watching. Not necessarily watching the cloud, because we don't do that anymore. But are we aware when God says, all right, here's what I need you to do? I'm still recalling a message I heard from Brent Svinsky's dad, Jerry Svinsky, when he started a church there in South Carolina. Driving on the road, and it just seemed like, he said, the Lord just seemed to tell me, I should stop at that house. And one of the first converts of his ministry there came from that house. Because he just stopped and shared the gospel with the lady who answered the door. That's amazing how God works. But so many times, too many times, I fear that we step back and we watch from the window while we pray. But there's more responsibility beyond that. Look at verse 14. And I'm not going to read all these verses because there's too many names. In the first place went the standard of the camp of the children of Judah according to their armies, and over his host was Nishon, the son of Minadab, and over the host of the tribe of the children of Issachar was Nathaniel, the son of Zuar. And if you just follow, kind of briefly look over the next several verses, here's what we have going on. It's by group, by army, by tribe, they begin to leave. And there is great order that is involved in their departure. Let me explain this here in a moment, but let me illustrate it this way. After we had moved, in fact, let me give you the second point. We need to know God's, not only His leading, but we have to acknowledge and know and follow God's order. When we lived in Greenville for a brief, less than a year that we were there, and I worked at a construction company, got promoted to foreman, and the whole construction industry, and perhaps there's times that Joe has lived this out as well, even in kitchens and bathrooms and whatnot, I would dare say, because this seems to always happen. Things seem to get done out of order, and maybe not even by man's fault, but just by circumstance. I recall in one particular case, one job site that we were working on was a school. And we were working hard all summer trying to get this building done. It was a huge addition on a current school building. And we were trying to get it done in the summer months so that they could start school back up. Well, about a month or a month and a half before school started, the school wanted to be able to get back into their offices. You know, the principal, the administrative offices. And so we focused on those offices first, and we got them done. We got the trim up, we got all the carpeting was in, the walls were painted, we even moved in the furniture for them, and they were completely set up. In fact, I believe they were already even working. We were still completing the rest of the building, frantically trying to get it done. And but the administration was able to get back to work and have their office, and it was completely redone. It looked, I thought, amazing. I had nothing to do with it. It looked amazing. Well, in the process of this huge addition, it wound up being the largest school in the state of South Carolina with the addition. And so as we were finishing up this gigantic of an addition there in Greer, South Carolina, we wound up having some sort of, the toilets in the back bathroom that we had put in stopped working. And so we got the plumbers in to figure out what in the world's going on. And they kind of, the cameras figured out that there was a joint that something wasn't right. You know where that joint wound up being? Right dead center of the administrator's office. Excuse me, sir, we're going to have to move you out for a time here. And I kid you not, it was within a half a day. All the furniture was out, the carpet was ripped up. There was a bobcat in the middle of the administrator's office with the jackhammer on the front end, throwing all the debris in, and so now and then literally there was a pile of dirt where there used to be a file cabinet this high, as they dug down and then had to replace this section of the plumbing, replace it all, put in the concrete back again, redo the carpet, repaint the wall because it just got so full of dust and whatnot. We had taken down all the trim and pretty much gutted out the room completely, so all that had to get put back together. And I just remember at some point, especially as we were digging out dirt, thinking, this just seems like the wrong order of things. This is not the way that this was supposed to have been done. What is fascinating about what is taking place here, and if I can find the right verse, we have verse 17, verse 18, and over the host of the tribe of the children of Simeon, and verse 19, over the host of the tribe of the children of Gad, verse 20, and the Gathalites set forward, burying the sanctuary, and the other did set up the tabernacle against they came. Now, there's probably nothing in verse 21 that makes any sense in English. Because even the sentence structure just seems like it's a foreign language translated into English. It really, at least in the King James, if you look at Numbers chapter 10, verse 21, it doesn't make any sense. Let me try to explain to you how this all worked out. As they left, and they left by armies, which means that as they left, in the front of the entirety of the children of Israel went all the young men of military age and ability, by tribe. And as they went, if you could picture with me in a simplified way, those that carried the outer parts of this tabernacle went first. And then those that carried the necessary, maybe if I could say it this way, the fabric of the tabernacle went second. And then those that carry, or the group there in the middle, and I kind of skipped over them. Verse 18, I believe, was Reuben. This tribe went through, and their responsibility was to assemble. And then came the stuff that went inside the tabernacle, and what followed in the very end were all the pieces, we'll say the office furniture, so to speak, that went there beyond. I find it fascinating that as they did this by the commandment of God, as they depart, it literally was so, that as the first group arrived, when the cloud stopped, the first group arrived, they set out the stakes, so to speak. The next group came, they did their part. The next group came, they did their part. As the final, the back group were all the elderly men and all the young men and all the women and all the children, all those that were in the behind part, as they arrived to where the cloud has stopped, the tabernacle is already completed. That is fascinating to me. Now back up backwards. What group is going to be prepared to go first? Let's say we're going to move this building. We're going to move it from here to over there, so we don't have a very far distance. If we have a group that's going to be taking the outside studs, we'll say this. We have a group that's taking the siding. We have a group that's taking the outside studs. We have a group that's going to be taking everything, taking the clock, the pulpit. What group is going to be ready to go first? Yes. What group is going last?
Yeah. Oh, going.
Leaving last. This group. Do you imagine the order that is involved in these verses? By the commandment of God. Hey, this tribe, you military men that are ready for battle, you are leading us out. You go in there first and you get all the simplify it, you get the furniture out. You stand over there with it because it's going to be a while. All right, you guys come in and you do this next part. And you guys go over there because it's going to be a while. All right, now you guys, and then you guys, and you guys. The four people that take down the last part, they're the ones that they finish their job, but now they just immediately leave. But everything is done in early. What would have happened if the guys that came in and got the clock off the wall left first, because this was the easiest job, so he just hit the road. He gets to where they're going now. He's standing there with the clock with nothing to put it on. How many times in construction that happens? Things just happen backwards. But how many times in our journey with our God, because we are rushing, because we're trying to do what makes sense to us, we're trying to, even in our own time management, trying to do things effectively in our vantage point, but by doing so, we're neglecting what God has called us to do. By the commandment of God, they go tribe by tribe, army by army, with a captain by captain over them, with specific parts of the tabernacle, so that as they arrive on that end, it gets set up piece by piece by piece, so that the last group that comes finishes it. As the rest of the children of Israel arrive, the tabernacle is done. By the order of God. Not my order. Not what I think is right. Not what I think is best. Not what I think in my own mind can justify. If I come in and my only responsibility is to get the clock, make it simple. Newtshorn, your job is you need to come into that tabernacle, you get the clock. Now, there's no clock in the tabernacle, but just using our own building here. You come in, you get the clock, and we're going to move it to Kiwani. I'm kicking that clock off the wall, and I'm saying, I don't know what you guys are doing, but I'm out of here. And it's going to take a long time to disassemble this whole building. Now, obviously, they're not looking at a structure like ours. It's a tent. But I've got my part. I'm gone. By the commandment of God, you stay. Wait. They go. Now it's your turn and you go. All the people that are outside of the military age and ability, all the women and the children, they've got nothing to do. You wait. By God's order. Boy, when things get turned upside down, what is the first thing that we do? My order. I do things my way. I do the things that make sense to me. I do the things that just work out the best for me, most convenient for me. Things are upside down in my world. I got to make it work the way I think it should work. We saw that even in churches back in March. This church is doing this church is doing that, this church is wanting nothing to do with this church is completely ignoring it. Everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. And I'm not saying one way was better than another, or one way was God and the other way wasn't. I'm just saying that we saw that in churches around the nation. Hey, we're doing this. We're not doing that. We're not doing a thing differently. We're not even having services. There are so many vast differences going on in the United States. Because we all want to do what we think is right. But have we followed what God has said is right? Have we followed His order? Look, jump to verse 29. We get to the very last end of their journeys out. In fact, let me read verse 8. Thus were the journeyings of the children of Israel according to the armies which they set forward. In other words, every time they stopped, here's what happened. Every time they left, here's what happened. This is how they traveled. So verse 28 is saying. Verse 29. And Moses said on to Kobab. I love how the Hebrew, if you look at the pronunciation of the Hebrew, it's nothing like what is actually spelt out. In fact, a lot of English words are that way. If you ever look at the pronunciation of an English word, why is it that they don't just spell it the way it's pronounced? How many of the, how do you say that? You look it up. Well, that's not how it's spelled. This is Kobab. You remember how we had Betel Ale? And I remember I kind of taught you how to say that correctly, to think about gambling of ginger ale. Think of Tammy. If you know my sister-in-law, Tammy. Kobab. This is Kobab. We have Kobab here in verse 29. If you know Tammy, there she is right there. Kobab. And Moses said unto Kobab, the son of Raguel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are journeying unto the place of which the Lord said, I will give it you, come thou with us, and we will do thee good, for the Lord has spoken good concerning Israel. Now there is great disagreement about who Kobab, besides Tammy, really was. Obviously there's a connection to Moses' father-in-law. There are that word there, and I didn't look up the pronunciation of this, Raguel. That is the same word as Jethro that we know for Moses' father-in-law. Many, in fact, believe that Kobab was another name, so that he actually had three names. If you want my opinion, when it says the son of, I'm thinking that Kobab was actually Moses' brother-in-law. He was the brother of Moses' wife, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, his father-in-law, brother-in-law is a relation of Moses' wife specifically. Said unto Kobab, the son of Raguel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are journeying unto the place of which the Lord said, I will give it you. Come thou with us, and we will do thee good, for the Lord has spoken good concerning Israel. What Moses is saying is, hey, you are not of a descendant of Abraham. You are not of us. But please come with us, because the Lord has spoken well of us, and if you come with us, you will be blessed. That's what he has said to this point in verse 29. Verse 30, and he said unto him, I will not go, but I will depart to my own land, to my own people, to my own kindred. In other words, Moses' my only connection to you is you and your wife. I'm going to go back to home. I'm going back to my people. Which is another reason for my support of this being his brother-in-law. We're told in Exodus that Jethro had already left. And so he either left and came back, which is possible, or he's already gone, but brother-in-law stayed. Now brother-in-law says, all right, you guys are leaving, so am I. Cloud's moving, you're going that way, I'm going back home. Moses says, no, please come with us. Verse 31. And he said, this is Moses speaking, leave us not, I pray thee, for as much as thou knowest how we are to encamp in the wilderness, and thou mayest be to us instead of eyes. And it shall be, if thou go with us, yea, it shall be that what goodness the Lord shall do unto us, the same we will do unto you. And they departed. And I love how at least the King James, but did you know that all English versions come from the same Hebrew manuscript? So really, ultimately, they all say this, and they departed from the mount of the Lord. Who's the they? Did he go with them? Moses gives this last argument. We need you to be instead of eyes for us. Here's what Moses is saying. We are heading into a wilderness. Moses, remember I said this, Moses was very well of the area of Mount Sinai. In fact, that's where he had been with the burning bush before God sent him. Moses was very aware of that area. They're heading into an area that Moses does not know. But clearly, brother-in-law does. Brother-in-law, would you come with us? We're going to a spot where I don't know. All we can do is what we can see. But you know where the water is. You know where this is and that is. You know all of these details. Please come with us. We need you to be more than just our eyes. There is a purpose. There's a responsibility. There's a great need for you to come with us. And they departed from the mount of the Lord. 3 days' journey, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them, and 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was upon them by day when they went out of the camp. And it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered. Let them that hate thee flee from before thee. And when it rested, he said, Return, O Lord, unto the many thousands of Israel. This is what I find fascinating about how our God works. And this really ultimately is my point, so I hope you're still awake to hear this. When they left the Mount Sinai, the cloud, as it had been to that point, left and led them. Where did it stop? They stopped. When it moved, they moved. But it was still necessary to have a man to say, that's where the water is. Do you not think that God could have said, we're stopping here because literally 2 feet that way is a well. I know you can't see it yet, but if you just barely touch the surface, water will come up. You think God had the means to do that? He certainly could have even made arrows out of the cloud that they were following. Water. Right there it is. You think God had the means to do that? Absolutely he did. You think God had the means to literally tell Moses, he had already been speaking to Moses by voice. You think he literally had the means to tell him, stop and tell Moses, Moses, you're going to go for a half a day, 30 miles to the due west, and when you get to this spot, you'll see 3 trees and the base of a mountain, and if you look off to your left, you'll see some water. That's where you're going to camp tonight. Did God not have the means to tell him all the details? God was a creator. He knew where all this stuff was. Why do they need Kobab? Why did Moses need this man? Because while God directs us many times in broad ways, he relies on us to do the rest. And I'm not trying to be humanistic there. I'm not trying to be, hey, it's about us. This is not about us pulling up our boots by our bootstraps and just going to work. This is literally about us realizing that God has called us to do something that we have the means to do. He will direct us, but we've got to do the work. We've got to do the commitment. It's not about sitting in the window. I never even gave you the third point. Not about sitting in the window watching and praying. God says, go. We've got to go do the work. We've got to fill in the blanks. We've got to get it accomplished. We've got to find the water. We've got to know where it is that we're going to stop to rest, to drink, to eat. And Kobab was necessary for Moses' standpoint because he says, I don't know this area. You do. We need you. You come with us. We will take care of you for the rest of your family's life. We will bless you as God blesses us. We promise. And they leave. What is fascinating, if you jump to Judges, you don't need to turn there, but if you jump to Judges chapter 4, verse 11, indicates that one of Kobab's descendants was still around in that time frame in Saul's day. God instructs Saul to destroy the Amalekites, but some of the descendants of Hobab were in that area, and so a message is sent out to the descendants of Kobab to say, hey, we're about to take and conquer these people. We made a promise to you. Move out, because we're moving in. The answer to did he go with is yes, he did. Because they needed him. There was a responsibility he had. There was a task at hand that he was there to do. Kobab wasn't an Israelite. He wasn't descended from Abraham. He had no connection to them other than the wife of Moses. But he is leading them spot by spot. Here's the water. You're going to have another, good amount of time without water. Stock up on your water here. He was the voice to say all the details that they needed to fill in. God could have, but God didn't. In those instances, how often does the church today step back and say, well, I don't know, I'm just going to pray about it? Use the armor that God has given us. Prayer is one of them. And remind ourselves that God has much more for us than just praying. There's doing that he has for us as well. As we follow his leading, as we follow his order, not mine, not what makes sense to me, but what is his direction, and as we know God's purpose. What is God's purpose in my life? What is it that God has called me to do? What is it that I'm willing to do as God leads me forward? Are we willing to be Kobabs? I don't know why Tammy chose to be a Kobab. I don't understand that. I know my brother. That may have not been her best choice. But are we willing to be Kobabs? Are we willing to be those that will say, I can do this? As God leads, I'll fill in all those spaces. That God is going to rely upon us to get the job done. And may we do that. Again, I'm not saying this is humanism. I'm not saying this is about us. This is about us following God, but realizing that he leaves us the responsibility to do the work, not just praying. So ultimately, do we know our responsibility? His leading, His order, His purpose. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you again for your word. I pray that you be with us as we consider the challenge of following you, going in obedience. I pray that we would live that out to your honor and to your glory, that we would understand what you've called us to, that we would have a duty to rescue, so to speak, a duty to engage, a duty to act. Certainly we need to pray. Certainly we need to be aware of your leading in our lives. Certainly we need to know what it is that you call us to do, even specifically in your word. But I pray that we be able to have the fortitude, the desire, the zeal to step forward and get the job done. And I pray that you'd use us in ways probably that we never imagined as we follow after you. In Jesus' name, amen.